the abandoned town that time forgot. It said that there's a town out there, tucked far beyond the edges of the world, that no man or woman has set foot in for over 100 years. Its name has been lost to time, and its story is nothing but a whisper carried on the wind. People don't speak of it often, but there are those who've heard the tales, who felt the cold weight of the old stories pass from generation to generation. It's a place that the sun forgets and the earth tries to erase, but the town remains, locked in a kind of twisted slumber, hidden from the eyes of the living. Long ago, in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, there was a settlement, a small community of settlers with hopes as grand as the mountains themselves. They spoke of starting fresh, building a life untouched by the turmoil of the world around them. For a time it seemed to work. People thrived in the valley, growing crops that fed them, trading goods with the surrounding towns. Life was simple, and that's how they liked it. But there was always something off. Something not quite right about the place. It started with the dreams. Folks in the town began to dream of things they couldn't explain. Some saw a shadow moving through the trees at night, others heard whispers on the wind when there was no one around. But most chilling of all were the voices calling from the depths of the old woods, beckoning the people deeper into the forest, where the trees twisted in ways that no human hand could have shaped. Old Jonah, the town's blacksmith, was the first to truly hear the calls. His family, like the others, had been born and raised there. He lived his whole life in that valley, hammering away in his shop, his hands rough and calloused from years of labor. But one night, long after the sun had set, he found himself walking through the woods toward those strange voices, his heart pounding as though it belonged to something else. He walked for hours, though he couldn't say why. The further he went, the colder it became, the whispers louder and more insistent. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Jonah had reached the center of the woods, where the trees grew so thick and tangled that no sunlight could penetrate. And there in the clearing stood a stone circle, a forgotten relic of an age long past. It wasn't a place meant for mortals, that much Jonah knew. He could feel it in his bones. And yet, there he stood, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with fear. The air was thick with something ancient, something old enough to have been forgotten by time itself. The ground beneath his feet trembled, the whispers growing into a low hum that seemed to vibrate in his skull. Jonah took one step forward, and then another, until he was standing in the center of the circle. And that's when it happened. The earth opened up, a gaping chasm yawning beneath him. Jonah screamed as he fell, his body plunging into the darkness below. The last thing he heard before the world swallowed him whole was a voice, clear and cold, speaking his name. The next day when his family awoke, Jonah was gone. His forge was cold, his tools left in disarray, as if he had simply vanished in the middle of his work. The townspeople searched for him for weeks, combing through the forest, but they never found a trace. The only clue was a trail of dark, twisted footprints leading into the woods, footsteps that didn't seem to belong to anything of this earth. After that, the town began to change. The people, once vibrant and full of life, grew restless, tired, and afraid. They stopped looking at one another the way they once had. Conversations grew stilted. Laughter became a rare sound, and it was always followed by nervous glances, as if the very air had shifted. The woods too seemed to change. They grew thicker, darker, as though they were encroaching on the town, pulling the people deeper into their fold. It wasn't long before the strange dreams spread. One by one, people began to vanish. First, it was old Mrs. Ellison, the widow who lived at the edge of town. One night, her door was found wide open, her house eerily silent. The town searched for days, but she was never found. Then came young Elias, a boy barely 14, who had been playing by the creek when he simply stopped coming home. His mother called for him, walking up and down the riverbank, but all she found was a single shoe, lying in the water. And still, the calls from the forest grew louder. One by one, the town's population dwindled. The people whispered, eyes darting nervously toward the trees. Some swore that they saw shadowy figures moving in the forest. Others heard voices calling from beyond the mountains. But the town's leader, Reverend Martin, refused to acknowledge the truth of it. He insisted that it was just the mind playing tricks, that the town was simply under a spell of fear. He held Sunday services with fervor, praying for the protection of the townsfolk, but even his own wife, Sarah, began to change. She grew paler by the day, her face becoming gaunt, her eyes hollow and distant. She spoke of the voices, the dreams, and the shadows that followed her every step. And then one evening, as the sun dipped low beneath the horizon, Sarah vanished. No one saw her go. One moment she was there, standing at the window staring out toward the trees, and the next she was gone. That night, Reverend Martin gathered the remaining townsfolk together. Desperation clung to his words as he spoke of finding their loved ones, of going into the woods to search for the missing, to reclaim what was theirs. But there was one among them, an old woman named Agnes, who knew better. Agnes had been living in the valley longer than anyone, and she had seen things that couldn't be explained. She was the last of the town's original settlers, a woman who had grown up in the woods, listening to stories passed down from her elders, stories of the very town they all now inhabited. "I warned them," Agnes said, her voice trembling but her eyes fierce. "I warned them about the curse. It's not just a town. It's a trap. A place that calls to you, pulls you in, and holds you forever. You can't leave once you've heard the call. None of us can." The townsfolk stared at her, their eyes wide with fear. "The town was built on ground that shouldn't have been touched," Agnes continued. "It was a settlement founded by those who made pacts with things they shouldn't have. The forest isn't just woods, it's a doorway. And once you walk through it, there's no going back." As Agnes spoke, the wind outside howled through the cracks in the walls. The trees groaned as if they were alive, their branches scratching against the windows. The people were scared, but they knew they couldn't stay in the town any longer. One by one they gathered their belongings, heading toward the farthest exit. But the path was no longer clear. The woods had moved, twisted, and blocked their way. They were trapped, and the only way out was through the forest. But that night, as the last of the townsfolk tried to escape, the earth shifted once again. The ground beneath them cracked, and the forest swallowed them whole, as if the trees themselves had become hungry. The town that had once been full of life was abandoned, left to rot in silence. But if you ask the old-timers, the ones who still remember, they'll tell you, the town hasn't really gone anywhere. It's still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting traveler to hear the call. And if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the whispers from beyond the trees. The abandoned town that time forgot is still waiting for its next visitor. The call of the forgotten. The wind howled through the abandoned town, a hollow wail that carried with it the scent of decay and lost promises. The houses, once full of life, stood in silence, their doors hanging crooked on their hinges, windows broken, and roofs sagging under the weight of time. The streets were empty, save for the occasional scrap of paper swirling in the wind. No birds sang here, and no animals dared tread the soil. It was a place forgotten by the world, as though the very fabric of time had turned its back on this town. But even in its desolation, there was a lingering presence. Something watching from the shadows, something that refused to fade into oblivion. Agnes had warned them. The town was no ordinary settlement. It was built on land that had been touched by something ancient, something beyond the comprehension of the settlers who had arrived with nothing but hope and ambition. They had come from distant lands seeking a fresh start, unaware that they were walking into a trap set long before they had arrived. The curse of the town had claimed them all, one by one, until only the shadows remained. But there were whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves on a forgotten autumn day. Some say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind howls just right, the town stirs. The houses creak and groan, and the very earth shifts beneath the soles of the unwary. The town isn't completely empty, not yet. It's waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its grasp. It's on one such night that a group of travelers found themselves on the outskirts of the valley, unknowingly heading toward the place that time forgot. There were 5 of them, young men and women eager for adventure, seeking a place off the beaten path to escape their mundane lives. They had heard stories of the abandoned town, tales passed down through generations, but they had never thought to believe them. After all, this was the modern age and there was no such thing as ghosts or curses, right? But the further they traveled into the valley, the stranger the landscape became. The trees grew taller and darker, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes, as if they were reaching toward the sky with desperate, gnarled hands. The road grew narrow and overgrown, and the distant sound of rushing water could no longer be heard. It was as if the world around them had fallen into an unnatural silence. One of the travelers, Henry, the group's leader, stopped the car just before a bend in the road. The headlights shone on an old, rusted sign, its words faded and barely legible. Read, "Welcome to the Valley of the Forgotten." Henry laughed nervously, shaking his head. This has to be some kind of joke. The others chuckled uneasily, but there was something in the air, something that made them hesitate before stepping out of the car. The silence was so complete that it felt as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. "I don't know," Sarah, the youngest of the group, said quietly, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. "It doesn't feel right. Let's just turn back. Maybe we should find a different place to camp." But Henry, ever the optimist, waved her off. "Come on, we're not scared of some old stories. This is just another place to explore. With a sense of both excitement and unease, they left the car behind and ventured into the woods. The trees grew thicker as they moved deeper into the valley, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every step they took. Soon they could barely see the path ahead, and the light from their flashlights seemed to waver against the darkness, as if something was trying to swallow the light whole. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. There were no sounds of animals, no chirping insects. Just the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. As they walked, Sarah could have sworn she heard something, voices, faint and indistinct, carried on the breeze. At first she thought it was the wind playing tricks, but as she strained to listen, the voices grew louder. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The group stopped and turned to her, their expressions puzzled. "What are you talking about?" Henry asked, though there was a slight edge to his voice. He too felt it now, the unease that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Sarah pressed her hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. "I swear, there's something out there. Someone is calling us." They all turned to look down the darkened path. The shadows between the trees seemed to dance, shifting and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. The path, which had once seemed inviting, now appeared as though it led into the mouth of something hungry, something ancient. "I'm not going any further," Sarah said, her voice steady now, though her eyes were wide with fear. But it was too late. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble, as if the earth itself was waking up. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying with it an eerie whisper, one that seemed to come from every direction. Come to us." The voices were clearer now, louder, unmistakable. They weren't the wind. They were something else. Something that wanted them. Henry swallowed hard, his confidence faltering. "We need to turn back. Now." But as he spoke, the shadows around them thickened, and the trees seemed to bend inward, as though they were being drawn into the heart of the forest. The town, silent and empty for so long, was calling to them, pulling them closer, closer to the place where time had stopped. "Look!" Peter, one of the other travelers, shouted, pointing ahead. "There's something, a light." They all turned toward the distant glow, faint at first, but growing brighter with every passing second. It was a pale, flickering light that seemed to beckon them forward, and before anyone could stop it, their feet began to move on their own. They walked toward the light, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The closer they got, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, until it felt as though the weight of the entire forest was bearing down on them. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light disappeared. They were plunged into complete darkness. "Where did it go?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The forest was silent now, but the tension in the air was suffocating. They stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen, unsure of what to do next. And then they heard it. A low, rumbling sound, as if the ground beneath them was shifting, as though something was rising from deep within the earth. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and in the distance they saw it, a shadow moving toward them, tall and impossibly thin. "Run!" Henry shouted, his voice full of panic. But it was too late. The town was no longer just a place. It had become a part of them, and it was drawing them in. The price of the forgotten. The shadow loomed over them, tall and unnatural, like the very darkness had taken shape and decided to step out from the trees. It moved with an eerie grace, its form indistinct but unmistakably humanoid. The whispers that had once been faint now grew deafening, filling the air with a cacophony of voices that spoke over each other, their words unintelligible but their tone thick with malice. The wind howled around them, making the trees creak and groan as if they too were alive and in pain. Sarah's heart pounded as she stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the wet earth. Her breath was shallow, her eyes wide with terror. She had heard the stories, of course, every child in her hometown had. The forgotten town, the abandoned place lost to time, haunted by voices and shadows. But never had she imagined it would feel like this, so real, so suffocating, so alive. The others were frozen too, caught in the grip of fear, unable to look away from the approaching figure. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring their terror. Henry tried to speak, to make sense of what was happening, but the words caught in his throat. No one could speak in the face of such an ancient, unrelenting force. And then, as the figure came closer, it stopped. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and the very earth seemed to sigh with an age-old weariness. The shadows receded, just for a moment, as if giving them a glimpse into the world of the town. The the place that time had forgotten. The light that had once beckoned them now revealed what lay before them. The town. It was not a ghostly apparition, not a trick of the mind or a delusion brought on by fear. It was real, though not as it once was. The buildings were standing tall, but they were twisted like the world itself had bent them out of shape. The windows were cracked, and the doorways seemed to stretch and warp unnaturally. And the streets were empty, save for the faint silhouettes of people who moved just beyond the reach of the light. "Where are they?" Peter whispered, his voice barely audible above the whispers that swirled around them. "Don't go in," Agnes's voice echoed in their minds, though no one had spoken her name aloud. The old woman's warning rang louder now, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Don't let the town have you. It takes everything." The group stood in frozen silence, each of them feeling the pull, the irresistible call of the town. The ground beneath their feet felt like quicksand, pulling them closer to the darkened heart of the valley. Sarah's hand shot out to grab Henry's arm, but it was already too late. His eyes were glazed, unfocused. The whispers had taken hold of him, too. He stepped forward, moving toward the town's darkened gates, as though he were drawn by an invisible force. "We have to go inside," Henry muttered, his voice flat, devoid of the urgency it had once held. "It's calling us. We have to know." "No!" Sarah screamed, pulling at him, but the grip of the town was strong. The shadows enveloped him, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something in the distance. A figure standing just behind Henry, its eyes glowing in the darkness. "Henry!" she cried, but he was already gone, swallowed by the blackness of the streets. The others were moving now, too, drawn into the abyss, their eyes wide, as though they had forgotten everything but the call of the town. They were lost, their minds slipping away as the darkness of the town wrapped around them. And then Sarah was alone. Her pulse raced as she backed away from the gates, her breath coming in short gasps. She could feel them, hear them, the voices from every direction, each one pressing in on her, demanding that she come closer, demanding that she join them. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, her heart thumping in her chest. She had to get out. She had to escape. But the town was moving, shifting. The trees closed in around her, and the sky above darkened as though the stars themselves had turned their gaze away. The ground beneath her feet grew soft, like mud, sucking her down, trying to swallow her whole. "No," Sarah whispered, stepping backward, but with each movement the town's grip grew tighter, its influence stronger. Suddenly the shadows parted, and before her stood a figure. It was not a person, at least not entirely. It was something ancient, something that had stood in the dark heart of the town for as long as the town had existed. Its form was humanoid, but distorted, as though the very concept of a human shape had been twisted beyond recognition. Its face was a mask, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the keeper of the town, the one who ensured that no one left. "You've heard the call," the figure said, its voice deep and echoing like 1,000 voices speaking as one. "You've come too far and now you must stay." Sarah could feel her mind fraying, the pull of the town strong, but she refused to let go. "No," she breathed, her voice weak but defiant. "I won't stay." The figure tilted its head as if studying her, its face unreadable. "You have no choice. The town is hungry. It will take what it needs whether you want it or not." In that moment Sarah felt it, the truth of the town. It wasn't just a place. It wasn't just the land. The town itself was alive, a creature that had fed off the souls of those who had entered its borders, trapping them in an eternal cycle of loss and despair. And now it wanted her. But Sarah, driven by the same defiance that had kept her fighting all this time, took a step back. She didn't know how, but she felt an instinct deep within her, something that had been left behind by those who had come before her, something that was part of the valley itself. With a sudden, sharp cry, she reached into the shadows and pulled at the very fabric of the town, the earth, the air, whatever it was that bound her to this place. She could feel it slipping away, the darkness, the whispers, the grip of the town. And just as she felt herself being pulled into the depths, she saw a flash of light, a memory, a vision of the old woman, Agnes, her face kind but full of sorrow. "Don't let it have you," Agnes whispered in the vision, her voice breaking the silence. "The town can't claim what it cannot see. Fight the pull." With that, Sarah took a final, desperate step back, ripping herself free from the town's grasp. And just as the figure reached out to stop her, Sarah ran, her feet pounding against the earth as the town screamed behind her, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The ends. The mystery of the town was not solved, but Sarah had escaped, barely. The cursed town still waits for the next traveler, hungry for the souls of the unwary, and the whispers never truly cease. The story of the town that time forgot is one that no one ever fully escapes, for it continues to haunt the land, waiting, always waiting.